Committee will come to order. Before our formal hearing begins, I want to invite Anna Corbett, who is before us today. Anna, thank you so much for being here. Whose husband has been detained by the Taliban for over a year. And we would love to hear your testimony about your husband and what has happened in your life. And we really appreciate your being here today. So with that, I'll recognize you, Ms. Corbett, for as much time as you need.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Meeks, members of the committee, thank you for providing me the opportunity to be with you today to share my family. month for mere minutes. We recently learned that Ryan has been fainting and experiencing seizures. He is often threatened with physical harm. He is told by his captors that he is forgotten and that his country doesn't care about him. And why wouldn't he believe it when other Westerners have come and gone so much faster than he? The impact on his mental health is unspeakable. Meanwhile, our family has done our best to adjust to life in the U.S. Our children, Our children transitioned from homeschooling to public school. Our children played soccer and basketball for the first time, and my oldest daughter was voted into homecoming court and learned to drive. Milestone birthdays have come and gone, including a sweet 16 and Ryan's 40th, all while mourning not just the absence, but the uncertainty of Ryan's condition and what he will be like when we finally see him again. We are grateful for the efforts that the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Ambassador Roger Carstens, and his office have made to bring Ryan home and for their nearly daily support. We are also appreciative of the bipartisan support in Congress to help recover Ryan. In particular, you, Chairman McCall, our local representative, Congresswoman Tenney, Leader Schumer, and Senator Gillibrand. You have truly been our champions. We are in communication with the White House and are thankful for the National Security Council's direct engagement and look forward to meeting with them this afternoon. Despite these efforts, we have been unable to even secure regular health and safety visits for Ryan, much less to progress efforts to secure his release. Ryan's detention is a tragedy for our family. It is also a tragedy for the U.S. that someone could be held simply for being an American. I know there are engagements to bring Ryan and other Americans like him home, but for us, the process has gone on for 15 months with no clear path, only one phone call and one brief welfare visit. I'm thankful to live in a country where both sides of the aisle are united on prioritizing the health, safety, and return of Americans wrongfully detained abroad. I am confident that bipartisan support in Congress will expedite bringing Ryan, an American citizen, home. We can all agree how important it is to bring my husband and my children's father back home to New York. I'm speaking now to the Taliban. Please end this. Please end hostage diplomacy. I don't know what it will take, but I need Ryan back. Our children need him. We need reassurance that Ryan will live long enough for this all to be resolved. My husband was trying to do a good thing for the people of Afghanistan. Now he is suffering, and so are we. We know that the U.S. and Afghanistan cannot move forward while American citizens are being wrongfully detained for political ends. I promise you that my family will not stop advocating for Ryan until he is released. Thank you, committee members, for allowing me to share our story and for helping us bring Ryan home.
Thank you, Anna. I know that was difficult but very powerful. And I, on behalf of myself and the committee, you have our deepest sympathy for what you're going through. I can't imagine the pain and suffering that your family is feeling right now. And we will do everything in our power to bring your husband home. I know that State Department's working with Qatar to try to get him out of there. It's just another example of how the Taliban operates. And I don't give up. I fight hard, and I'm going to fight hard for your husband. And I would like to turn it over to Mr. Meeks for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I too want to thank you, Mrs. Colbert. Your story that you've just testified to is compelling. It is something that I think that all of us on this committee and in this Congress are focused on. We can only imagine the pain that you've gone through over the last 15 months. How you and your family has been deprived of your husband, who all he wanted to do was make life better for others. We can only imagine what you're going through. And so we commend you and thank you, because I know doing what you've done and going public is not easy. It is very, very difficult. So I hope that more ears are open to help bring Ryan back home. And we will do everything that we can, because the Taliban is wrong. America has not forgotten about Ryan. America will never forget about Ryan until he's brought home to you safely. Thank you for being here this morning. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Committee will take a brief break for our next witness to be seated. The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss the effects of the Biden administration's Afghanistan policy since the U.S. withdrawal. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the country is no better off today than when the United States first entered. After 20 years of blood and treasure, any progress made has been erased. And it didn't have to be this way. This administration's deadly and chaotic withdrawal was ill-conceived from the very start. There were no plans for enduring peace and the support of the Afghan people. The Taliban, who now control Afghanistan, are terrorists who impose theocratic edicts to oppress the Afghan people. They abuse women and steal humanitarian aid from starving Afghans. They partner with terrorist organizations such as al-Qaeda and Tariq-e-Taliban. Ayman al-Zawahiri, al-Qaeda's leader and bin Laden's top lieutenant, was living in downtown Kabul under the protection of the Haqqani network and the Taliban, specifically the Taliban's Minister of Interior and Haqqani leader, Siraj Haqqani. Taliban holds several American hostages. In fact, the committee just heard from Anna Corbett, whose husband Ryan has been detained by the Taliban for over a year. This is unacceptable and shows the deeply flawed approach this administration has taken since the Taliban regained control. Under the Taliban rule, women and girls describe their day-to-day lives as living under house arrest. They are barred from public places and are not allowed to travel outside their homes without a male chaperone. Afghanistan is the only country in the world where girls are banned from receiving an education above the 6th grade. Now Afghanistan is currently facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. People are starving. In fact, 15.3 million Afghans are food insecure, and nearly 1 million children need life-saving treatment last year due to malnutrition. And the recent earthquakes in October 2023 have made the deteriorating situation even worse. The United States is the largest donor of humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, spending more than $2.5 billion on assistance for Afghanistan since the withdrawal. Unfortunately, we know the Taliban are engaged in theft and diversion of these funds to serve their malign purposes. What troubles me is the Biden administration is pursuing a policy of engagement at all costs and has failed to hold the Taliban to account for their crimes. The Biden administration meet with the Taliban frequently, praise the Taliban often, and haphazardly send billions of taxpayer dollars into Afghanistan. Through these policies, the Biden administration has all but recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And yet, over the past 2 years, on every metric, the Taliban has only become worse under this administration's policies. On women and girls, seemingly every week, the Taliban announces new edicts stripping away their rights. On diversion of humanitarian aid, Taliban interference has increased by 32% this year. On support for terrorism, the Tariq-e-Taliban, who the Taliban have equipped with weapons the U.S. left behind, is increasingly conducting terror attacks, and al-Qaeda remains safely in Afghanistan under Taliban protection. On hostages today, there are more Americans detained by Taliban than at any point since the U.S. withdrawal. Obviously, the Biden administration's policies are not working. I want to be clear that my heart is with the people of Afghanistan who are suffering under the Taliban. I believe it is our moral imperative to help these people who the Biden administration abandoned. However, we must be clear-eyed about our priorities and must develop policies that will ensure the U.S. is supporting innocent Afghans and not the Taliban. Anything less signals a failure of American leadership. And with that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Meeks, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this important hearing. Despite no longer having a physical presence in the country, the United States continues to have vital interests in Afghanistan. We were just reminded by Anna Corbett, Ryan Corbett's wife, the safety of Americans in Afghanistan and around the world continues to be a priority for the Biden administration. And just as the Biden administration successfully recently brought 5 hostages home from Iran. We need to make sure that we bring the hostages home that are in Afghanistan. Any stability in Afghanistan is critically important to our national security interests. We must ensure that Afghanistan is never again used as a base to plan attacks against the United States or our allies, and that the Taliban uphold their commitments to that effect. The limited assistance we provide to support the most vulnerable in Afghanistan also ensures that the gains made over the last 20 years are not completely lost. During the course of our almost 2 decades in Afghanistan, a large segment of our assistance focused on advancing the rights of women and girls and other minorities. This interest remains a key priority for members on this committee, in this Congress, and the American people. And it is vital that we continue providing critical humanitarian assistance that benefits the Afghan people, not only because it is the right thing to do, but also because each of those other goals I've mentioned become much harder to achieve if Afghanistan faces a humanitarian crisis or economic collapse. But let me be clear, I'm under no illusions about the Taliban, and I wish they were not in control of Afghanistan. But American engagement in Afghanistan continues to serve our national interests. It is critical that we preserve the space to engage with the Taliban where we must. But I don't believe we will get better policy outcomes by denying that reality. Instead, we must be strategic about how we can pursue our goals in a uniquely challenging environment. I believe the administration has been careful to strike this delicate balance. I know administration witnesses wanted to appear here today, and I'm disappointed that our majority colleagues did not take the State Department and USAID up on their offer to testify today. It would have been useful to inform our understanding of the Biden administration's policy approach towards Afghanistan. We need to hear from them. Oversight remains a critical component of our work, but this work is more meaningful when the administration can explain its priorities and perspectives directly to Congress at a hearing specifically for that purpose. So, Mr. Chairman, the committee has also conducted staff-led, closed-door, transcribed interviews with 10 current or former State Department officials to date on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It is imperative that final transcripts from these interviews be made available to all members as soon as possible to inform our ongoing oversight of Afghanistan policy. Mr. Chairman, I know you have asked for transparency from this administration and expressed your desire to get answers for the American people. So I would also urge you to make these transcripts publicly available to all American people. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for convening this hearing. And I want to say to Mr. Sobko, I look forward to hearing your testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. I do want to state for the record that we did invite witnesses from state and USAID. However, they refused to testify alongside Mr. Soko in front of Cigar, and I thought that was unfortunate, even though there is precedent for that. But with that, we're pleased to have the Honorable John Sobko, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, before us today. Sir, your full statement will be made part of the record, and I now recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Meeks, and members of the committee. 2 years after withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, the United States remains the largest donor to the Afghan people as they continue to suffer the unprecedented humanitarian crisis previously alluded to. Unfortunately, SIGAR's work has documented that the Taliban is diverting or otherwise benefiting from a considerable amount of that assistance. Let me outline some of what diversion and interference by the Taliban looks like in practice. The Taliban demands payoffs to permit the implementation of aid projects. The Taliban dictates who receives assistance. The Taliban pressures the UN and other NGOs to hire their members, relatives, and allies to help distribute donor-funded assistance. The Taliban pressures the UN and other NGOs to issue contracts to Taliban-affiliated companies. The Taliban pressured the UN and NGOs to partner with Taliban-affiliated NGOs and to not partner with other NGOs. Those are non-government organizations. The Taliban have embedded intelligence officials in UN agencies to supervise their work, facilitate the interference and diversion, and censor reporting about it. The Taliban also collect taxes and other fees from UN and U.S.-funded implementing partners. Now, such interference and diversion of U.S. assistance is not unique to the Taliban. Nevertheless, the diversion of humanitarian assistance by the Taliban is of particular concern given the unprecedented humanitarian crisis Afghans now face, as well as the Taliban's terrorist ties. Unlike in the past, diverted U.S. assistance may now fund terrorist activities in addition to enriching the pockets of corrupt officials. SIGAR's work shows that there are no good choices for policymakers when providing humanitarian assistance in an environment like Afghanistan. Only trade-offs. To a large degree, our research confirms that those who controlled the guns control the aid. Now, many would like to believe that we are aiding the Afghan people while successfully bypassing the Taliban. This can be viewed as a useful fiction, as it reassures but ignores the fact that it is impossible to entirely bypass the Taliban regime. Now, that fact alone does not mean we should end humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people. That is a policy decision for Congress and the administration, not one that I or other oversight bodies can make. My point is that as long as the United States continues to provide aid for the benefit of the Afghan people, it is paramount to use whatever tools are available to reduce Taliban diversion and interference, including strengthening compliance, vetting standards, and third-party monitoring. In addition, Congress and the administration should look to lessons identified from other development programs around the world for more robust practices to protect our assistance. As we look to the future, U.S. policymakers will need to consider the following risks to our assistance: the financial risk of wasting a sizable portion of U.S. humanitarian and development assistance, aid that already amounts to $2.5 billion since the Afghan government's collapse, the security risk of U.S. funds reaching a government with long-standing ties to terrorist groups, and the political risk of funding an historic enemy of the United States. For our part at SIGAR, we look forward to offering additional recommendations on this subject in our forthcoming reports, which we have undertaken at your request. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shopko. From what I understand, it's not surprising that Taliban is diverting funding from the United States into their own coffers, including aid to terrorist organizations.
I'm sorry, sir. Yeah.
I understand from your testimony, I'm not surprised that the Taliban is diverting foreign aid to the people of Afghanistan for their own purposes, which would include funding terror organizations.
We have heard that, and our analysis so far has shown that.
Is there any way to influence bad behavior with this funding?
There may be a way to do it, but we have not seen any positive response from the Taliban from us giving that aid.
For
Again,
instance, they don't allow girls to be employed by the NGOs. Is that something that could be brought up with the Taliban? Do you think that would have the funding would have any influence over that policy?
I believe it has been brought up by our government and other donors in the UN, but I don't believe it has accomplished anything.
Or perhaps releasing, Mr. Corbett, we just heard from his wife, releasing him from prison. Do you think they would have any pressure or leverage to release him?
I cannot speak to that. I have not been involved in negotiations for any of the hostages' removal. I have not been involved in negotiations at all with the Taliban, so I can't tell you for sure. But all I can tell you is we have not seen any improvement on the way they treat women, on the way they treat former Afghan soldiers and officials. There's been a number of killings of that, and I think this committee may be hearing from General Sami Sadat later this afternoon, or at least one of the subcommittees. Yeah. And I think I met him and I've talked to him numerous times. He'll document the number of people, number of former soldiers and government officials who have been brutally slaughtered by the Taliban. So I don't think giving the aid has affected the Taliban at all.
On that point, we had Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, testify before this committee, and she said, in her words, that there's not been a consistent pattern of our Afghan allies, quote, being murdered by the Taliban, end of quote. Do you agree with that statement?
No, I do not. And SIGAR has interviewed numerous former Afghan officials and Afghans who have documented. And then just last week, my deputy just came back. We have a very extensive outreach program to the Afghan diaspora, and interviewed a former Afghan civil rights, human rights activist who just gave us a horrible, horrible explanation of what happened to her brother and sister-in-law, who were brutally shot dead, and another brother who was beaten to death by the Taliban. So this is something we have heard from many Afghans, and I think corroborating those horrible stories, the UN just issued a report this summer that documented over 200 extrajudicial killings of former government officials, and I think that's an understatement. Wow. So I totally disagree with Secretary Nuland.
So in your testimony is that the Taliban is actively hunting down Afghan partners that we worked with, that our troops worked with, special forces worked with, and they are brutally torturing and murdering them?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And are they taking the biometrics that were left behind to identify them?
We have heard that. We haven't been able to document that. But unfortunately, we left a lot of biometric and a lot of other information, not only on former government officials, but also on former contractors. So the question about do the Taliban know who our former contractors were? Well, we have databases that they have access to. So it is a very difficult situation for anybody who worked with us who remain in Afghanistan.
And to your knowledge, what are they doing with the $7 billion of weapons that were left behind at Bagram?
Well, they're using them. We know that. They are parading them around, particularly some of the higher, more sophisticated weapons, including some of the helicopters, planes, and other hardware. There have been allegations, but we have not been able to confirm that some of those weapons have left Afghanistan. But I would only assume from what the Taliban is up to that it's a buyer's market for former U.S. weapons, but we have not been able to document that yet, sir.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. And finally, what would be your recommendation with respect to the foreign aid, that we are being very compassionate, very generous. And I, from a humanitarian standpoint, I want to help these people who are starving to death. But what would be your recommendation given the corruption?
It's an awkward situation. I'm an inspector general. We don't do policy.
Right.
I mean, what I'm saying is if we don't give assistance, I think the humanitarian disaster that I think Mr. Meeks and yourself referred to will happen. I mean, people will just be starving and dying on the street. Yeah. Whatever control or influence we have, which I think is minimal, will disappear if you cut that. But if you are sending the money, what we're saying is let's learn from experiences around the world how to do this when we're doing, and we're doing this in other countries where we don't recognize the host government or we don't want to deal with the host government. So what we're saying is, and these are the reports that we're preparing for you, sir, and the committee, are looking at best practices, and I think you have to include that. So if you're going to give aid, do it smarter. Because we have very little oversight and very little control in the country right now. So that's what we're urging.
That's very good advice, sir. We have votes on the House floor right now, 2 of them. So the committee will take a very short recess and reconvene following the votes.
committee will reconvene, and I will now recognize Ranking Member Meeks for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Soko. Let me ask this, and I'm listening to your testimony and some of the questions that Mr. McCall asked. My first question, because there's concerns, I hear on one hand that folks are saying we abandon women in Afghanistan, and then on the other side saying we shouldn't engage to help women and girls with reference to the dollars that we're giving, because we're giving money to try to make sure that we help women and girls and not lose some of the things that we benefit from. That we heard the testimony earlier in regards to Ms. Corbett about getting her husband out, but then at the same time, if we don't engage with the Taliban to get him out, it's difficult to get him out. So it seems to me that we can't have it both ways, and I want to ask you this, because I too am concerned about the impact Taliban control is having on the status of women and girls in Afghanistan. And I would be remiss if I didn't say I'm also worried about any diversion of assistance. And I am also concerned about the potential of undoing the gains that were made during the 20 years that we were in Afghanistan. So my question would be to you, in listening to your testimony, what added oversight mechanisms do you think must be put in place so that we can continue to limit the funding for things like girls' education, access to employment for women, and access to health care, so that we can make sure that we're still doing that? What mechanism would you think we should put in place?
It's a very good question, and just so you know, I mean, we are working on a number of requests from the chairman. We're not finished, so these are preliminary analyses we're doing. But one of the points that we have raised repeatedly is that we've been relying on international NGOs like the UN and the World Bank. And although they're great organizations, we have historically documented, and the AID has agreed with us over time. We go back to like the first time I spoke, I think, before Congress, talking about the limited access we have to the books and records and information from the UN and the World Bank and the World Food Organization, et cetera. So we really need to focus on getting access, because these are international organizations, and if you go back to, I think, the statute passed in 1945, we give them special authorities, and we also, in a sense, immunize them from normal oversight that aid would do or state would do with if there was an organization here in the United States. So one of the things we're nervous about is because of the situation. This is why I talk about this situation is a bad situation. There are no good answers. There's no good alternatives. Because we cannot deal directly with the Taliban, because we don't recognize the Taliban, because we can't send American contractors in there and American employees from the state and aid, we actually are over-reliant, I think, on international organizations who, and again, if you take a look at the high-risk list report, which we issued, we just documented there's a problem dealing with them.
That's why I think it's important to have USAID and the State Department here, not to testify, like as opposed to you or anything, but on a separate panel, so that we can hear from them as to what they are doing and what they're trying to do. For example, we talk about the Afghan Central Bank assets, which is being held in the United States. The whole fight is whether or not they would end up in Taliban hands. But if I understand the mechanism correctly, the Afghan Fund Board makes decisions unanimously, but the U.S. Treasury has a seat on the board. So we have some oversight on what's being utilized there by having a seat on the board that could prevent a unanimous decision being made. That's oversight. But, you know, what's your assessment of those safeguards and the impact our presence may have on the ability of the United States to not only to decide what goes where, but to direct how the Afghan fund is used?
Well, Mr. Meeks, you raise a very good point, and we have a report that's now sitting over at State Aid and Treasury for their normal review. It should come out next month. The chairman requested it, looking at the Afghan fund. And this, I'm glad you're asking that question. I would love to answer more. I know my time is shortly running out. But we have some concerns about it. That's $3.5 billion that President Biden gave to help the economy of Afghanistan without going through the Taliban. And a noble cause, we just don't know how it's going to be done. I mean,
that's why we got somebody on the board. Instead of, and it's got to be done unanimously.
Well, we have a question about how they picked the people on the board. And if you, in our statement, we raised some serious concerns about one of the people on the board, and I don't want to mention names in public. We found some really derogatory information about that person. And I mean, I know I got super sleuths working for me, but this was like just doing a Google search. And when we brought it to the State Department, they said, well, hold it, we didn't know anything about that. So one of the questions we raise is, what type of due diligence did you do to appoint some of the people on the board? There's another person on the board who is actually a member of the Taliban Central Bank. And there's no conflict of interest rules in this. So I would love to talk in more detail. We are seriously concerned. That's $3.5 billion. Now, that was moved from the Federal Reserve in New York, moved to Switzerland, following Swiss law. Now, look, I'm an old country lawyer. I used to be a federal prosecutor, but when I talk about Switzerland and funding, I don't think openness. So why is the money there, and why are we following Swiss law for this? So those are questions we're asking, and sir, I think you're right on point. We need to look at that, and you need answers from State, you need answers from Aid, and you need answers from Treasury about why we are doing this and how we're doing this. That organization has been in existence for 1 year. They still don't have any internal regs and policies. So what have they been doing for a year? Those are the questions I think you should ask, and we're happy to provide them to all members of the committee. When you finally do bring Mr. West and whoever up here, I would love to have sat with him. I have been trying to meet with him since he was appointed. I have met with every, they're called the SRAPs, Senior Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. I've met with every one of them under every administration until Mr. West. He refuses to meet with me. Now, I don't know why, but that is a problem. So I would have loved to have been in here with him testifying to actually meet the guy.
I hope you get a chance to, if they're invited to testify,
Yeah.
As you have testified today, so that we can ask those questions and get those answers. Thank you. I'll give you back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Meeks. And I'll state again for the record, as the chairman has, that both State and Aid were invited today and withdrew their participation. And it's notable that you've literally never met the man sitting in the same building. But thank you. I now recognize Mr. James for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sopko. We appreciate your time here and your honesty, your passion. I remember how President Biden went in front of the cameras and tried to reassure the world that Afghanistan could hold, and what happened? It didn't. Clearly, this administration is far from functional and far from cooperative with United States Congress and far from transparent with the American people. This administration's failed withdrawal in Afghanistan led to $2 billion in taxpayer-funded military equipment being left behind, thousands of our Afghan allies captured and slaughtered, and the killing of 13 precious service members at Abbey Gate. And we just heard about Ryan, who feels like he's being left behind by his government. Well, I would like to echo the comments from my friend, Ranking Member Gregory Meeks, Representative Gregory Meeks, that Ryan has not been forgotten. He is not going to be left behind. We'll do everything that we can to bring him back home safely. Despite all of this, we are still funding Afghanistan, the Taliban, with $11.11 billion still flowing from the United States, with the gaps and the lack of oversight that you just mentioned. You said that there's so much more to discuss. Well, sir, I would like to hear more about that. I would like for you to continue along answering the line of questioning that Mr. Meeks asked just recently. What additionally do you have along the details that you shared that you would like to share in the next 3.5 minutes?
Well, I think the point I would like to make is this entity, which I assume many of you don't know much about, which is shocking in and of itself, because that's $3.5 billion that's been moved for the benefit of the Afghan people. Again, a noble cause to try to organize or help the economy of Afghanistan and the central bank. But the appointment of people to it, this fund, I think Mr. West was quoted as saying that it wasn't a very open or democratic process. So we,
And again, you've mentioned that you work in the same building with him, and you have not seen
no,
him yet.
I don't work in the same building with
Okay.
him. I don't want to say. He's at the State Party, SRAP.
Okay.
But
But you've made countless entreaties to meet with him, to gain understanding, and he has not cooperated.
And I've met with prior SRAPs. I mean, no one has a problem with us talking. We share information. We learn what's going on and what their issues, and we try to help them. But the State Department has basically obfuscated and delayed many of our reports. And it's not just him, it's other people at State, and we've gone out of our way to try to work with them. But we're still not getting cooperation. Now, we are getting cooperation from USAID, and I must thank the members of this committee and the members of other committees who have actually come to our aid on this, and USAID has been very responsive, but we still have problems with the State Department on not just the fund, but on getting material in general.
And so because the State Department is failing all over the world, and particularly with transparency with Congress and the American people, you are being forced to gain your information from other sources. What are some of those other sources, and what makes them problematic? You mentioned the UN. Could you go into a little bit more detail from some of the areas that you're getting your information and what you're missing?
Well, we still get information from USAID on a regular basis. We do, off the record, get information from people at the State Department. We have an aggressive...
off the record, sir. Why off the record?
Well, because a lot of people just don't want to be identified as talking to us. Actually, one of the things that State Department issued, and I have they basically ordered all of their employees not to talk to us.
Do you have something stating that specifically that you could share with the committee?
We can definitely share that with you, sir. And in our last protocol that we tried to write with them, we asked to include that the department should rescind any prior directive to its employees not to communicate with SIGAR, and State Department scratched that out.
And so we have evidence showing that employees of the Department of State are being directed by their leadership not to communicate with Congress and the American people.
Well, I'm not talking about, I'm talking about SIGAR.
Well, we've experienced some of that same lack of transparency, and I think that oversight is exactly what is needed. It seems like a State Department that feels like they are above oversight. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. I recognize Mr. Barra for 5 minutes. Mr. Keating for 5.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank you for your work. It's been very important work, and it's work that I think we have to look within the whole 21-year time frame to really learn the lessons we have to learn. How important is it to look over the full 21 years versus taking snapshot to snapshot when we look at this?
I think it's very important to look at the whole 20-year experience there and to also look at our experiences around the world. And that's where we can learn some lessons, because we don't have all of the knowledge here in the United States and obviously not in Afghanistan. That's what we're doing for the chairman and this committee right now in our reports.
What is the status right now of the U.S. government in terms of recognizing the Taliban formally?
My understanding is that we do not recognize the Taliban, period, as the government. I think we even refer to them as sort of like, I don't know what the reference is. We don't recognize them.
I just want to be clear on that so that it's very clear for the record that the United States does not recognize the Taliban, just to clear up any conceptions that might have been coming forth from this hearing. Also, if you look in the context of 21 years in this conflict, I also want to draw your attention to, February 29th of 2020, and it's when President Trump announced that we were going to withdraw. My understanding, talking to allies, there wasn't a great deal of notice for that. There wasn't a great deal of notice with our military for that prior to that. And indeed, when that kind of announcement occurs, doesn't that have an effect on how the withdrawal is going to be conducted from that point forward?
It does, and we've issued reports talking about the impact of those negotiations on the ability of the Afghan government to respond to the Taliban.
So getting back to the importance of looking at this over that time frame, it's important to look through 3 administrations and to look at everything that was done during that period if we're truly going to learn, which is what the objective of this committee is, from our actions, so that some of those actions in the future won't be replicated. In the little time I have left, I just want to shift to Pakistan's role in terms of counteroffensive, but also in terms of the refugee issue. It's been uneven, I think, and it's something that's critical, I think, in terms of having them be a participant in this. Can you just discuss, if you could, take your time, and discuss their role and what they could be doing more, and some of the unevenness I alluded to?
I think the most recent actions by the Pakistan government we've identified as causing problems, and that has to do with, I think it was in October, they announced that they were going to expel all Afghan refugees. Now, these are refugees. These are millions of people who had been there prior to the Taliban taking over and since then. And, in our high-risk list for 2023, we talked about the problems with the resettlement program, and this caused major concerns because there are a lot of Afghans who worked for us, who were part of this SIV program and part of this program to get out of Afghanistan and into protection, who are covered by that initially. And I think the UN estimates there's 1.6 million Afghans sitting in Pakistan that are going to be returned. No, excuse me, 1.6 million, I think, Afghans fled. 600,000 are in Pakistan. Now, about 2,500 of those people, plus you got to add their families, are waiting for resettlement to the United States. So Pakistan, just on, I believe it was last week, said, no, we're not going to push those people back to Afghanistan and potentially to their doom, but we don't know for sure. And so that's causing a lot of concern for us at SIGAR, because we have some people sitting there too. And what was a real awkward situation is we got contacted by the State Department again, and they asked all U.S. agencies, including me, including SIGAR, to basically do a Sophie's choice, to give them the list of the top 10%, and they would try to help them. And we did, but the situation where you're asking U.S. citizens to basically say which 10% are going to survive and what happens to the 90%, and of course there was no promise. So, I mean, I don't want to do a Meryl Streep imitation here from that movie, but that's what every U.S. government agency who had SIVs or other, people who were helping us had to do. We had to decide and give the names of those 10%.
All right, my time has expired, but I did, which I tell my colleagues, I'm leading a letter to the Pakistani government to try and have them reconsider the actions they're taking, because fundamentally they're at the crux of this particular crisis. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I support that totally.
Ms. Wagner, 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for convening this very important oversight hearing. It's been stunning so far. Sapko, I appreciate your time and your many years of service as Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR. I'm tempted to just let you talk, but let me just say that more than 2 years after the utter collapse of Afghanistan and the botched U.S. withdrawal, SIGAR's work is more important than ever to ensure that more U.S. resources are not falling into the hands of the Taliban, as we've heard. It was obvious from day one that the Biden administration's shameful flight from Afghanistan would be a disaster and a humanitarian tragedy, and it was. It was nothing less than a betrayal of our service members and the brave Afghans who lived and worked and fought alongside them. We must and we will get to the bottom of this debacle. While the State Department has done its best to hide the incompetence that resulted in U.S. lives lost, our allies betrayed, and thousands of non-combatants left behind, we are forcing them to show the American people the evidence. At least I hope we are. This committee will not rest until the administration takes responsibility for its total failure to protect U.S. troops and citizens like poor Ryan Corbett, are still being held hostage for 15 months, and that there is accountability. Mr. Sapko, I just want you to elaborate if there's anything more we should know, because I know that last year you informed Congress that the Biden administration was refusing to respond to your request for information. You talked a little bit about State Department, USAID. Can you provide any additional update or examples, sir?
I am happy to do that. First of all, I must say, again, I want to thank this committee, the members, the chairman, the ranking member for supporting us, and because it's helped. USAID is cooperating fully. God bless them. So we're getting that information. We can use that information to do our job and to report back to Congress.
But where are you not getting information?
Department of State. We have 20 outstanding requests for information on ongoing audits with State. 4 of these date to October of 2022, and one is more than more than 1 year ago. 13 of the outstanding requests for documents from State should have been readily available. Just give us reports. But they refused to give them to us. And their reason is, and this is very interesting, I am certain the State Department will come up and tell you that we are responding to SIGAR. Well, responding is different than being responsive.
Correct.
For example, State Department provided responses to our request for a description of activities to address gender-based violence, something which I think Congress should be interested in, and we're paying money about right now in Afghanistan, and we'd be interested in. However, State refused to provide us with documents relating to the funding, the contract awards, or the monitoring reports related to those activities. And the outrageous thing is their explanation for refusing us is those documents related to monitoring and evaluation of these programs are, quote unquote, internal. Well, for heaven's sakes, we're auditors. Has anybody ever talked to an auditor or an inspector general? I don't know what the State Department inspector general does, but you look at internal documents.
Correct.
That's what you hired us to do. State Department is saying we can't give you anything that's internal. State refused to provide those documents, and over the last several months, my staff has been trying to negotiate with them to get this material, but it still hasn't been successful. Now, as recently as Wednesday, November 8th, State Department, quote, refused to resume full cooperation with SIGAR, refused to permit SIGAR unrestricted access to its employees and implementing partners, refused to rescind the prior directive to the employees not to talk to SIGAR, and refused to direct its employees and implementing partners that they are required to cooperate. We actually sent them a memorandum, and they scratched out all of those things.
Mr. Sapko, my time is expired. I am horrified at this reckless disregard of the Inspector General and of you and the entire process here. It is just a flagrant disregard of their oversight responsibilities to Congress and to you through our auditor. So I look forward to any information you want to share with us. I have a lot more questions, Mr. Chairman, and I will submit them for the record. But thank you, and I'm so sorry for what you have been through.
Thank you, Ms.
By our own
Wagner.
government. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. Mr. Bear is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to continue a line of questioning that my colleague, Mr. Keating, started on. Just want to make sure I have the numbers correct in terms of it was 1.6 million Afghans that were displaced to Pakistan, 600,000 that remain in Pakistan. Is that correct, Mr. Sapka? Okay.
More than 1.6 million Afghans have fled Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover. 600,000 are residing in Pakistan.
Okay.
Now,
And the number I'm most interested in, again, is of that 600,000, we roughly, you'd say 2,500 of those plus their families would qualify for the SIV program.
I think we're hearing 25,000. I'm sorry
25,000.
if I misspoke. It's 25,000.
25,000
are
plus
waiting
their-
for resettlement, and that's under
Okay.
various programs to the United States.
Okay. So we ought to focus on those folks, because I assume those are individuals who either supported our troops, supported our mission in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades, or have ties and, a reason. What can we do to, again, we can relitigate the past and mistakes and things, but one thing we can do affirmatively, and my district, I believe, has the largest number of Afghan refugees in Sacramento County. So a lot of these folks, I imagine, have ties to my constituents. For those 25,000 plus their families, we have to do right by them, right? We have to do everything we can to, these are folks that helped us. What are your recommendations of what we should be doing to speed up this process or get them to third countries if Pakistan is not going to keep them there?
I'm going to go out on a limb on this because we have not done an audit of the SIV program.
Would that be under your purview?
Well, I think somebody asked us on the Congress to do that, and it's not specifically in our jurisdiction, but we offered our assistance to state and aid, and then the state IG decided to do that, so I think they're still looking at it. But one thing I would focus on, and again, when the Taliban took over, the SIV program was saying it would take 26 months to process an applicant. It has just been reported by the Association of Wartime Allies that at the current pace, that 26 months is now changed to 31 years.
Right.
So it's either a funding problem, or it's a morale problem, or it's a not interested problem. I don't know what it is. I haven't been asked to audit it.
I mean, my guess is it's a process problem, right? I mean, if it was the process that was in place pre-withdrawal, that process was already incredibly backlogged and going slow. I can only imagine how much more difficult it is today with lack of paperwork, lack of, to try to do these clearances. Again, that said, we have an obligation to, look at that, think about how we can, certainly the folks that helped us, supported us, that are at risk if they were to get sent back to Afghanistan, I think we've got a moral obligation to do everything we can.
I agree.
you share that?
And, sir, it's not only those that worked for the U.S. government. It's the people who believed in the U.S. government and were independent journalists or were judges or were, like in our case, we have people who were prosecutors and police who actually were trying to clean up corruption. And those are people, they didn't work directly for us, but they believed in us. They believed in what we were selling, and that is rule of law. And those are the people who are equally in dire strait.
Well, that's something this committee, since we have jurisdiction over some of that process, ought to take a look into how we can, help those 25,000. In the few minutes or seconds that I have left, could you just comment on regional stability as well, in terms of, we do worry a little bit about spillover of terrorism and to other parts of the region. Certainly Pakistan's, had some of that. Are you seeing it in any other, areas?
Well, we are aware of the regional instability in that area. We have not done any audit work, so I would just be reporting on what we're hearing. But I think General Sami Sadat, who was one of the best Afghan generals and one of the most aggressive ones, I think is speaking before this panel or a subcommittee of this panel this afternoon, and I think he can talk more about that than I can. He told me, he gave me an earful when I met him as part of our outreach program. And actually, we may be coming to your district because that's where we're getting a lot of information is from the Afghan diaspora. So we're actually trying to set up some meetings out there to learn more. So I think that's a useful
Great. Let us
way to
know
do
if
it.
you're in the district.
I definitely will. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Barra. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Sopko, thank you again for your tireless work over many years on this issue. If I could just pick up where Mr. Barra was on the SIV issue. My understanding, and if I'm hearing you correctly, Mr. Sopko, you would like to audit the SIV program and have been denied that cooperation, or you need to be formally requested by this committee?
Well, I think it's a useful program to look at, but I think the State Department IG said they could do it on their own, so we defer to them. We have a process in place. It may not sound like much, but we have a process in place to deconflict with other IGs. State Department said they could do it, and we said we can give you whatever information we can.
So the State Department can provide, per Ms. Wagner's questions, the State Department can provide its, quote, internal documents to an IG, but not to your special IG, apparently.
Yeah, that's what it turns out. And they were arguing.
And is that consistent? Oh, I'm sorry, they were arguing what now?
They originally argued that because Afghanistan collapsed, there was no more reconstruction. And we told them, well, the statute, our statute gives us jurisdiction to never really define reconstruction, but looking at all humanitarian programs and basically all programs that benefited the Afghan
And what's unique
people.
is you can look across the interagency.
That's the
DOD,
point.
USAID,
That is
state,
the
right.
point. You hit it, Mr.
Was
Chairman.
this your experience with the last administration, or even the one prior? This lack of cooperation, the fact that you've never even met. You were hoping to meet today the SRAP, the Special Presidential Envoy?
Well, it's been difficult. Let's just say this. We had gotten, cooperation from the Obama administration and the
Why do you
Trump
think you're not
administration.
getting it now?
Well, it may be a legal argument, but I think we've proven that legal argument is not accurate, and I think the appropriators believe we're correct, and I think committees like this believe we are. I don't know.
So along those lines, when you have the acting Deputy Secretary of State, Ms. Newland, testifying that she has no evidence of our former allies being murdered, prosecuted, essentially hunted down, do you think that is malicious, misinformed, ignorant? I mean, just a quick Google search shows UN reports, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, your own outreach.
You know, I think it was, I don't know who, somebody wiser than me said, don't infer evil intent when it could just be incompetency. I don't know if that was Napoleon.
Okay, well, I think we'll go with best case incompetence. But I think we have our suspicions.
Mr. Chairman, I don't mean to be flippant, but a lot of times, what we've learned is that bad news doesn't float up. There are people who want to keep bad news away from.
I've been around this town, sadly, a long time, and I've seen from top down, they make it clear it's not welcome. And it's not good for your career to challenge the orthodoxy and the bureaucracy. Just in the limited time I have left, on June 9th, the UN noted that the Taliban is providing al-Qaeda members with monthly welfare payments and Afghan passports, which should ring counterterrorism alarm bells all over the world. The Ministry of Interior, as you know, is now run by Siraj Haqqani, a longtime interlocutor between the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Have you seen in your reporting how integrated al-Qaeda is? Does this seem accurate? Do you have anything to weigh in there?
Up to now, sir, we haven't. We're aware of the UN reporting, but we have not done any independent work on our own in that area.
What would be the process to help you do some independent work there?
Committee can ask us to do it. I've never refused.
And we also have reporting, well, I'll certainly work with the chairman to ask you to do that. We have reporting of the UN's reporting the Taliban is using al-Qaeda training manuals. There are 30 to 60 senior al-Qaeda officials in Afghanistan, 400 al-Qaeda fighters living in Afghanistan, training camps, welfare payments, suicide training. So I would certainly hope that your office would start digging into that.
Well, can I just mention one thing we have been digging into, and that's, again, from our outreach program, is how the Taliban are shutting down regular schools and forcing the kids to go to these super-duper madrasas that are basically focused on radicalization. And actually, my deputy and my staff that were down in Houston were talking to a number of people, and they are particularly concerned about this, because you're going to have a whole new generation of Afghans who have been educated on becoming terrorists, little terrorists, and that's our big concern.
Armed with billions of our taxpayer-funded weapons and now with taxpayer-funded aid that is being diverted. Thank you, Mr. Sopko, and I now recognize Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witness. You know, through the course of this hearing, we've had some members say we need more diplomatic relations. Some say we need less. Some say we should never talk to the Taliban. Some say we need to bring hostages home. One thing we do know for sure is we don't have relations now, and as we have created this vacuum, China has moved in. So we've heard about the impact on the region. I don't think you do much study of that, or the impact on Pakistan, but let's talk about China. We have left this vacuum. China's moved in. They've sent an ambassador to Afghanistan. Could you talk about how our lack of diplomatic relations gives us an opportunity to China, and what might be the result of Afghanistan joining in the Silk Road, Belt and Road initiative?
I wish I could. We have not looked at that, so I would just be repeating anecdotal information we've heard. We haven't done an audit on that. China was always interested in Afghanistan. I assumed with the Taliban takeover, they continued that interest. And we are hearing anecdotally that they're involved in, particularly with extractives. But we have not looked into it, and we cannot document why all of a sudden. But they've always been interested in extractives in even under the prior regime in Afghanistan.
Well, could you comment on how you foresee the return of our diplomats to the country, and what are the risks of not going back, or some of the advantages of going back?
Again, ma'am, I have not looked at that. There are obviously risks. The decision of sending diplomats there is a decision that really is a policy decision beyond my pay grade. That is a decision made by the administration or Congress to recognize. And I think basically the president is the only one who can recognize another country, I believe. So, you know, I can't really tell you what are the decision points on that. So,
Well, if you haven't studied that, and it's not your pay grade, and you can't get information from the State Department, what is it that your office does and should continue doing?
well, we are trying to find out. We're doing audits and investigations on theft or diversion of funds. We are trying to come up with recommendations on how to do a better job in a country like Afghanistan where we don't recognize the host government.
Would you share with us some of those recommendations?
We will. We'll actually give the report. We're not done yet. I started to talk about some of our preliminary recommendations. One is to use the international organizations less until you can get better oversight from the various international organizations. I referred to a 1945 statute that created them, which basically cuts back the amount of oversight that any U.S. government agency, including my office, can do. So that's one thing.
I don't usually think of the World Bank, which you mentioned earlier, as an NGO. I mean, that's not exactly what you think of as NGOs, but are there any NGOs that are effective on the ground outside of that financial world?
There are some NGOs that are doing work in Afghanistan that are doing good work. The problem with the international organizations like the World Bank and the UN is they are not actually doing the work. They're basically just another layer. They subcontract to others to do the work. Some are Afghan NGOs and some are international NGOs. And that's another problem. You got multiple layers, multiple expense because of multiple administrations. So we're saying that's one thing you should look at. And there's a number of other recommendations that we're, you know, happy to share once we finish our report.
And when will that be?
Well, we're hoping in the near term, in the next few months. I know some of the staff is here. It'll be a few months before that's done.
And have you been to Afghanistan? Do you have people on the ground there?
Oh
Is that
gosh,
safe?
no. There's no Americans on the ground in Afghanistan. I used
Well,
to
we know
travel
one
on a
is in prison.
That's the problem. That's why we're not there. I used to travel all the time to Afghanistan. We used to have dozens, I think we were up to about 50 people at one time in Afghanistan in the old days. But nobody, nobody from the embassy, nobody from any U.S. government agencies are in Afghanistan right now.
And so most of your information is secondary, hearsay, diaspora?
Diaspora, secondary, we're interviewing UN officials, we're interviewing World Bank officials, we're interviewing NGO officials. We've actually done, we do have some independent civil society organizations that we're working with in Afghanistan that are providing us information. We do get documents. And although we can't subpoena the State Department to get documents, we do have subpoena authority over corporations or NGOs that are working there. So we get documents that way. We also get material by talking to other countries that are working there. So we have a large, you know, swath of information that we're getting. We're not getting the internal contract documents and materials that we would normally get from the State Department.
Yeah, I
and
heard
that's
that
the problem.
earlier.
That your time has expired. Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Perry for 5 minutes.
Thank the Chairman. Mr. Sopko, thanks for your attendance today. Can you tell us how many Afghan or estimate how many Afghan refugees are coming to the United States through Pakistan or from Pakistan through the Special Immigrant Visa or U.S. Refugee Admission Program referrals? Any clue about that?
I don't have that in front of me. I thought I did, but I.
Well, if your staff can get that even while we're
Okay.
here, that would be awesome. But I'd like to move on a little bit while you're kind of looking for that. You did explain in your testimony the use of humanitarian aid, but I'm a little bit lost on $5 billion plus appropriated to the DOD to transport, as it says, to transport, feed, and house Afghans in FY 22 and 23. Can you tell us what this money was used for?
We have not audited any of that monies right now, so I can't tell you specifically. It's basically for resettlement.
So is it being used in the United States of America?
I think most of it is in the United States.
Why would
of
it be in DOD if it's being used in America?
I don't have an answer to that. I can find out.
Is that the appropriate place for it? Shouldn't that be, I don't know, at least in state? Why would it be in the Department of Defense? Why is it their job to pay for transport, food, and housing in the United States of America of Afghan refugees?
Yeah. My staff said initially a lot of those people were on military bases, and that may have been why it was charged to the DOD accounts.
So do you think that all $5 billion, I mean, they're not still there, are they? What happens to the rest of that money?
I can't answer that question right now. I'm happy to look into that.
I'd love you to take a look back into that, and I'd also like to know if any of that money is being funneled back into Afghanistan. And as long as we're talking about that, and I think you've kind of gotten into that a good bit, I haven't been here the whole time, but it seems to me that the humanitarian aid that the United States might be sending it's unavoidable that it falls under the Taliban interference or influence. And we continue to use these tax dollars for some reason in Afghanistan, which pays into a corrupt system, supporting a regime that is at war with the United States and essentially killed United States service members. Based on your assessment of what you see from your position, I know you're not going to Afghanistan, and I don't recommend that you do, but our tax dollars sure do. Should we cease all assistance until some solution becomes apparent? Because aren't we essentially funding our enemy?
I'm in an awkward spot, and that's because I'm an inspector general. As an IG, no IG should be doing policy. We do process.
Okay, you pay taxes, right?
I do, and
Okay, do you want your tax dollars, as a guy with a front row seat to where those tax dollars are being spent, do you think it's a good use of your tax dollars to be spent on the Taliban located in Afghanistan?
I don't think that's a good use of tax
Okay,
dollars
fair
to go to the Taliban. A certain percentage, it probably is going to the Taliban. We know that.
Is
But
any
as to-
percentage okay? What percentage?
I'm sorry?
What percentage is like acceptable to go to the Taliban?
You know, I don't know.
Murders children and women and hates the United States and took our weapons and killed Americans. What percentage? Like if you sent $1, how much of that dollar should go to the Taliban?
I wouldn't set a dollar amount. I don't think any money should go to somebody who's trying to kill Americans or killing our friends.
It'd be
But
easy to solve if we just sent zero, wouldn't it?
well, that's a policy decision that I think you have to make.
Well, we're
because
trying
then-
to get the information. Let me ask you this. I think you claimed that 100 new Taliban NGOs emerged in Afghanistan during a single quarter in 2022.
Yeah.
What do you suppose the intentions are behind expanding Taliban-aligned NGOs, and how does it play out with UN, the decision to ban UN agencies in Afghanistan from partnering with NGOs that the Taliban deems to be unacceptable?
I think that's a frightening perspective, and I think that's why we're sending a warning to state and aid and to other donors that the monies may be going up. You may get a Taliban NGO, if I can just finish, sir. You may get a Taliban NGO, which is quote-unquote helping women's rights, which is trying to get money from the U.S. government. Up to now, we have not documented any money
And
going
you're not
to
going
the
to document
Taliban.
it because you're not there, right? I mean, how are you going to document it?
Well, we can still get information from other people. Remember, we have
And
people
I'm
in the
sure they're
government.
all truthful and not.
Well,
All right, my time is
not all,
expired. I
not
yield.
all, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Jackson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCormick. Thank you so much for your time today and your transparency. Can I ask you one question? Was there a particular reason why the United States left Afghanistan September 11th, 2021? Was the date symbolic?
I don't know why
Okay,
the
like
date.
9/11, September.
Yeah, it was 9/11,
11,
yeah.
like, didn't know if there was anything. If there was something that we could pry into regarding the State Department's actions, how can we help you do your job better and the information that you need from the State Department?
Well, I think if this committee sent a bipartisan request or notice to state that they should be cooperating with us, and we're happy to provide you chapter and verse of where there's a lack of cooperation, that would be very helpful.
Okay, we see there's an acceleration in the amount of humanitarian assistance that's needed, that more children are going into acute care for malnutrition. What specifically can you add to that to share with us? Is this going to continue to accelerate? Is it staving off? Is it at a level that can be managed? Are we able to provide more assistance to curtail this humanitarian crisis that's unfolding?
Well, I don't know if the humanitarian crisis is going, but I think our assistance has not grown proportionally. But again, that's a decision made by state aid and Congress on the amount of money you want to give. I don't think there's been any effect of our assistance on improving the core or the causes of the crisis in Afghanistan.
Will there be, under your estimation, from the boots on the ground, the general sentiment, how are Americans perceived in Afghanistan at this moment?
It would be hard for me to say. I know the people who have left Afghanistan, the Afghans, love us, but I can't speak for what the average Afghan thinks.
Could you explain how is the Taliban fulfilling any of their obligations with the agreements that were left in place?
Many of their obligations they are not following. There's some question on their connections with terrorist organizations. They haven't been following that. They promised to abide by humanitarian policies on women, children, et cetera. They're not abiding by that. They had promised not to use extrajudicial punishments for prior government officials or employees or soldiers. They're not abiding by that. I can give you a total list of all those promises, but they're not abiding by any of them.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields. Next gentleman to be recognized is Mr. Mast for 5 minutes.
Appreciate it, Mr. chairman. I want to go to some of the, you've struck a chord with a lot of your comments, and I think a lot of my colleagues, and we appreciate your candid and open nature of conversation with you. You're an auditor, right, to be frank? A bean counter, was that?
Well, I'm a former federal prosecutor. I'm a prosecutor.
Tasked with auditing.
Yes.
Waste, fraud, abuse in Afghan reconstruction. I would be quantifying that correctly? Okay. And in that, you used the term never, quote, never defined reconstruction. Is that correct?
Yeah, the statute doesn't specifically define. Reconstruction is. It's, you got to take a look at various portions of it.
And so that's the nature of my first question.
Yeah.
You're tasked with auditing something. Do you whether it's because of some specific sentence in a document you were given or because of something somewhere else. Can you, as the auditor, define what Reconstruction is?
We have defined it in, basically, if you look at the statutes, and I'm happy to give you chapter and verse, it can be defined as assistance to the benefit of the Afghan people. That's how we've interpreted it. That's how the appropriators have interpreted it. And only recently has the State Department interpreted it as it doesn't cover anything else, and it doesn't cover any of the programs in Afghanistan. Even as specific humanitarian programs that we were auditing before that the State Department and aid was cooperating with, once the Taliban took over, the State Department said those programs are no longer Reconstruction.
So to the best of your knowledge and what you can recall seeing, reading, being lectured on, whatever, to the benefit of the Afghan people. I'm a firm believer when we look at U.S. policy that we say in any bit of it, USAID or anything, does our policy support what we want for each country? I have it written on a board in my office because we should always, in my opinion, be answering that question. So in your statement there, to support the Afghan people, can you see clearly in anything you've said what we want out of this for the United States of America?
Currently, right now?
I'll let you answer it now.
Well, right now, I think that's a problem. We don't really have a strategy articulated by the administration on what we're doing in Afghanistan, a specific strategy for Afghanistan. We used to do that on a regular basis.
Right.
Well, we haven't. Yeah. We don't.
That's amazing. It's not the most provocative thing that you can hear, but it is amazing that, we're talking about whether it's $11 billion since, this year or $3.5 billion since this year or whatever the time frame is. We don't have a strategy, really an aim for Reconstruction other than blasting a shotgun out there and saying, hopefully one of those BBs, supports the Afghan people, but not an aim to support what the United States of America wants out of that relationship.
It's correct.
I don't know that there's another question I can ask you because there's not an answer. There's not a specific for you to give me in that, so I don't.
That's a problem we've been facing in Afghanistan, I think, for 20 years. We didn't really know what our objective was. Or it changed, or it morphed. And that's very difficult if you're an auditor or an investigator, particularly if you're an auditor or if you're a congressman. If you don't know what you want to accomplish, how do you judge you're getting there? And that's what we saw on a regular basis. And we've raised that numbers of times that, we look at inputs, we look at outputs, and we look at outcomes. What's the outcome you want to achieve by being in Afghanistan? Now, there may just be a straight humanitarian. We want to help people not starve to death or die. And that may be an articulated objective. And I'm not saying that isn't a good objective to have.
But even that is really, like you said in your comments as well, noble cause. You use the term noble cause to identify that, and that's true, noble cause. But even that, we don't do that without the purpose of saying we want to see a friendly government there. Or, we want to see safety in our embassy. We don't have an embassy there. Or we want to see hostages returned. Or we want to, there is still an end state in humanitarian support for any entity for the United States of America and our taxpayers. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
There's substantial discussion earlier when I was here about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It certainly wasn't pretty. But there's almost no time in history when there can be a retreat that is nice to look at. It wasn't nice to look at in Saigon. It wasn't nice to look like in Afghanistan. One of the intelligence failures was the belief that because the Afghan army clearly had the capacity to fight against the Taliban for a 3-month period, that they would. The fact is that once we were withdrawing, and everybody expected the Taliban to take over, who is going to give their life just to provide a 3-month window between our withdrawal and the Taliban's victory? Our intel community confused capacity with willingness. But I do not think that we're going to go back as we analyze this and say, oh, if we had just done it better, it would have been beautiful. I'll ask our witness, we have very few tools available to get Afghanistan to do what we want. We can bomb them. Nobody's suggesting that. We can prevent them from getting other economic relationships with private sector companies and with the IMF, but that undercuts our effort to help the Afghan people, and we can provide direct aid. The aid we're providing is not only a problem for those who focus on Afghanistan. I've been advocating for 27 years now that we spend more money providing nutrition and health and education to the poorest people in the world, and I can't think of a better way to undermine that effort than to let the American people know the truth, which is that the money we send to Afghanistan is in part purloined not just by the ordinary corruption, but also by those who want to fund terrorism. Do we have any tools other than to tell the Afghan government that we will not provide the aid? We can threaten to, we can cut it off, we can threaten to cut it off. Any other tools we have available?
Well, there's certain auditing tools, there's certain tools.
Well, there are auditing tools for us to discover how much of our money is stolen.
Yeah.
But do we have, and it'd be nice to get a report, but do we have any tools to get them to stop stealing it?
No.
Okay.
No,
So
we don't have leverage. We had very little, we had leverage before, we have no leverage now, really.
now, there's a limited amount of money that Congress will provide to providing nutrition, health care, and education to the poorest people in the world. Every dollar we spend in Afghanistan is a dollar we don't spend in Eastern Congo or Northern Ethiopia. Do we have, if we were to not spend money in Afghanistan, but to spend more in those other places, would we feed as many hungry people? Would we educate as many people who are desperate for education?
I can't answer that. We didn't look into that. Again, that's a policy decision. I think I told you, and maybe now it's hit home, that there are no really good choices in Afghanistan.
Yeah. I mean, there's a tendency when you have limited resources, you just spread them out and say, well, we did something here, and we did something there, and we did something here. So don't tell us that politically difficult thing, oh, you did nothing for that. But the fact is, if we did twice as much in Eastern Congo and half as much in Afghanistan, we might be helping just as many people. And the advocates for foreign aid tend not to want to have that discussion because they believe we should be doing both and all of the above, but Congress is limited. So the one way that we could have some leverage is if Afghanistan realized that if we can't make sure the money is spent well in Afghanistan, there are other places we can spend it. How much do they care whether this aid gets to their people? Is even the threat to cut off aid leverage, or are they in favor of ignorance and starvation?
There have been statements made by senior Taliban officials. And again, one thing you have to realize is the Taliban is not monolithic.
I do.
And as you well realize. But there have been some statements made by some of the, I would say, the Kandahar Taliban, who basically said, we don't really care. Now, there may be more practical people in other areas of the country, and maybe that's what we're trying to reach out to. But that's a diplomatic issue that we don't
We
really
need
look
to
at.
explore whether this money can do more in Africa, and I yield back.
And the chair also recognizes that when a gentleman from the other side of the aisle is talking about not spending money, then we should pay careful attention. With that, I recognize Ms. Young Kim for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the chair and the ranking member for holding today's hearing on Afghanistan. You know, it's been more than 2 years after the withdrawal, and we have seen today a complete reversion of progress on women's rights in Afghanistan. And according to SIGAR's most recent quarterly report, the several multilateral institutions and international NGOs released statements arguing the Taliban's abuses against women and girls constitute crimes against humanity. And SIGAR previously noted that education is banned for girls past grade 6. Women and girls are banned from public parks. Women are banned from boarding a flight without a male guardian. And women are banned from working with NGOs or the United Nations. While USAID does not engage directly in negotiations of MOUs with the Taliban, the USAID does have a policy on MOUs between the Taliban and NGOs operating in Afghanistan. So I'm interested in hearing about this policy with regard to the protection of women and girls. Mr. Sobko, does state or USAID require Taliban MOUs signed by US-funded NGOs to be submitted for approval before signing?
I believe we have not taken a real look at those MOUs, but I think AID told us in January of this year that there's a new mission order allowing implementing partners to sign MOUs.
So you have not seen any MOUs?
Well, provided they are approved by AID and justified as necessary. So I don't know if my staff has seen any of those MOUs. Let me just check.
Mm-hmm.
Have we seen any of the MOUs? Yeah, we have. Some of my staff have seen it, and we have samples of those MOUs.
Well, I would like to see some of that too, okay?
Okay, if we can arrange that, yeah.
Does USAID's criterion have requirements that MOUs do not include prohibitions on women working with NGOs? Any staff member that have seen the MOU, can you talk about that?
Yeah, I know AID is pushing against it. I don't know. We'll have to double check those MOUs to see if they have anything about women.
Is USAID or UN able to enforce protections for women NGO workers that are implementing U.S. assistance?
I don't believe they can. From our discussion with UN officials, I mean, I know they initially shut down all of their cooperation with the Taliban over that issue, but I believe they have eventually decided, and I will stand corrected if my staff tells me otherwise, that it was worth more to get the aid out. So they have not stood up to the Taliban on that.
It's really important that we provide the protection for women workers there too, the NGO workers. So I would hope that we can pay attention to that as well.
We're happy to get back to you and more specifics on the MOU. Okay.
You know, is the U.S. continuing to fund education initiatives for children past grade 6 in Afghanistan, following the ban on girls attending school past this grade level? And what about the United Nations?
I don't know if we've looked at that. We issued a recent audit on the education funding, but I don't know if we looked at that time. It covered the period of them preventing them from going beyond the 6th grade. Do we know? We'll have to get back to you on that.
Oh, gosh, we didn't get much information out of you today, didn't we? Well,
I don't know if I would agree with that, ma'am.
well, thank you. I'll back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman, Mr. Stanton, is recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Inspector General Sopko, for being here today. As we focus on the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the resulting impact, I want to thank the many Afghans who did work alongside U.S. forces and U.S. officials for 20 years, particularly members of the female tactical platoon. These courageous women risked their lives by doing what male soldiers couldn't in a majority Muslim country, searching and questioning women and children in pursuit of Taliban targets. During the 2,000 missions they served alongside Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers. Their work to support the United States mission, along with their gender, makes them and their families top targets for the Taliban. Yet not all of them have been allowed to come to the United States, and of those who are in the United States, 1/3 are still awaiting asylum. I will continue to push Congress to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, a necessary step towards repaying and saving those who served alongside the U.S. Mission. Inspector General, I know what you earlier clarified with questioning from my colleague, Representative Barra, that you don't have direct jurisdiction to audit the Special Immigrant Visa Program. However, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction's most recent quarterly report does include updates from the State Department regarding the Afghan SIV program. What steps has the Biden administration taken to address the needs of Afghans who did partner with the United States in various capacities but would not be eligible for SIVs?
Again, because we have not been tasked or to look at that, we haven't. We're just reporting what the status is, an updating on what's happening that's significant. We have not looked into that issue.
What has the Biden administration done to expedite SIV processing?
Again, we have not looked at the SIV program specifically.
Okay. The previous questioner talked about the impact of Taliban policies, terrible policies as it relates to women. The Taliban discriminates heavily against women, highlighting the vulnerability of the female tactical platoon members who are still in Afghanistan or who have not been granted United States visas. Are you aware of any actions the international community could have to compel or motivate the Taliban to lift some restrictions on Afghan women and girls, particularly limits on education or participation in civil society workforce?
I know the international community, including the UN and United States, objected to it, but it wasn't successful. I don't have an answer to what could have worked with the Taliban. I think you have a situation where the current leadership of the Taliban really don't care what we think about women's rights.
Okay. There are reports now that Pakistan wants to forcibly remove up to 1.7 million Afghan refugees immediately. What impact might Pakistan's plan to forcibly remove, what might be the impact, excuse me, of Pakistan's plan to forcibly remove Afghan refugees?
Well, if it includes people who worked with the U.S. government or assisted the prior government in doing work, it puts all of those individuals in peril. Just recently, the Pakistan government announced that their repatriation of Afghans would not include people in Pakistan awaiting the SIV or the P1, P2 process to be finalized. The problem is we don't know if that's firm. It could change, the whims of the Pakistan government. It also doesn't really address the other issue, and again, I apologize that we haven't looked at the program, we haven't been tasked to do it, that it's going to take years for those people in Pakistan to either hear a yay or nay to coming to the United States or another country. So it causes concern. I think you're concerned about it, and we are too, about what Pakistan is doing.
All right, thank you very much. I have other questions. I'll submit it in writing, and I will yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Baird is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and Mr. Sopko, we appreciate you being here. You know, the vicious attack in August of 21 killed 13 Americans, and others have made reference to that. But the reason I wanted to mention is Corporal Sanchez was from Logansport, Indiana, which was in my district. And then now Afghanistan faces a collapse of their economy, and they face a humanitarian crisis. Back in April, during your testimony to the House Oversight Committee, you mentioned that the State Department and USAID's refusal to provide SIGAR information leaves it impossible to say whether the United States provided taxpayer dollars to the Taliban or the Afghan terror group. So here's my question. Have you received any update, and based on what you've said so far, but have you received any update on this from either the state or USAID? And can you give any clarity if the United States is giving money for humanitarian assistance to the Taliban, or if the Taliban have diverted other funds?
I think in my testimony and my written testimony, we have documented that the Taliban are receiving U.S. funds. We haven't been able to identify the exact amount. And as I mentioned in my statement, thieves usually don't advertise how much they steal. We do know they have done that. Some of this information came from USAID. Some of that information came from our own hard work of our staff. We've sent out questionnaires to NGOs, and the vast majority of them have said that they have been shook down by the Taliban, have given assistance, and some of that is U.S. assistance to the Taliban. We've also documented that the Taliban has forced NGOs to give assistance to their friends, their soldiers, and not to give it to other people, particularly minorities like the Hazara. So we've done a pretty good, fair job of doing that. We don't have the exact amount. I think we identified of taxes and licensing fees about $10 million for sure. We've documented that went to the Taliban. We are still working on that, and it may take some time, but it's difficult. It's difficult to get that information.
So do they take a tax or a fee on almost everything? Is that how they're getting some of that? And then they divert, in the other cases, they divert it all, is it?
It depends. I mean, there's sort of a, I don't know if one of my staff, I think, referred to as sort of a kleptocrat's handbook on this, that they're following everything you can think of. You got to hire their contractors for drivers. You got to rent the cars from their people. So they're using multiple methods of doing it, and that's the difficult thing. And again, I made the statement is it corroborates, I think, an old statement that those who have the guns have the aid, and they have the guns, and they're using every attempt. What was also troubling is that the Taliban have actually infiltrated the UN organization. And they've infiltrated a number of these NGOs by placing their people in it, in those organizations, and that was documented by other organizations too. So it's just a myriad of ways that they are trying to get this money. And
thank you. I appreciate your information in that regard. And my time's about up, so I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Burchett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize if my questions have already been asked. As the 435th most powerful member of Congress, sometimes that happens. But when I ask them, I want you to respond. That's very thought-provoking, even though you probably answered it 3 times already, if that's all right, sir. Is there any way that the U.S. can provide aid to Afghanistan without any of it falling into the hands of the Taliban?
No.
That's what I like. Fred Thompson said, "They'd never be afraid of a one-word answer."
It's impossible.
He was a great communicator. Are you able to track United Nations funding to the Taliban? And if so, how much aid in American dollars?
We're trying to do it, as I did mention before, we've actually documented about $10 million, and I'm not certain if this went through the UN or other NGOs, but $10 million in fees and taxes that's gone to the Taliban.
Okay, and that is through UN dollars that are American dollars.
Well, it's American dollars, and,
Right.
you know, yeah.
Okay, $10 million. What sort of military equipment is now in the hands of the Taliban, and what do you think the value of that equipment was when it was left?
We did a report on that estimate of how much material was left, and it was basically based upon a report done by the Department of Defense. I don't have the exact figure in front of me, but it's multiple. Yeah, $7 billion in equipment, and that includes everything from airplanes to guns to bullets to boots to you name it. So it's a massive amount of equipment.
7 billion?
Billion with a B.
Yes, or 10 million for United Nations and 7 billion in armaments. Okay. And we've been told that the Taliban has more moderate members now, which I don't know that I believe that or not, but do you believe not allowing women and girls out of the house is moderate?
No, I would not believe it's moderate. It's basically a slave state over there. The women are the slaves. So, no. I mean, there are moderate compared to, it's like comparing Attila the Hun to somebody else. I mean, it's
You've got
moderate.
suicide bombers, and then you've got those that would just
Just
take
to kill you the
themselves out
normal
with a
way.
hand
Yeah.
grenade kind of thing. Yeah, I got you. Okay, well, I believe that's all of my questions. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. You've been
And
very.
no one else asked those questions before, sir. Let me just tell you.
Is he telling the truth, Mr. Chairman?
As far as the chair is
Well, I
recognized,
trust you.
yes.
That young lady beside you, I trust her. So, all right.
With that, the gentleman yields, and with that, I recognize the all-patient Mr. Huizinga. Matter of fact, for 7.5 minutes.
Yes, give
By
him all
special
my
privilege.
time, please.
Well, I appreciate that. I do have a 1 o'clock meeting, but my apologies. Earlier today, I was passing a bill through the House Financial Services Committee dealing with Iran sanctions. And that, obviously, in light of what has happened with Hamas, is very important. But one of the lessons that we've learned is about the fungibility of money. And so that's what I want to kind of pursue, and my colleague was asking about that equipment value and those kinds of things, that, what was left literally on the battlefield for the Taliban to pick up. And I thought it was interesting. I had one earlier, one of my other colleagues was kind of trying to make the point, I think, that the U.S. government doesn't officially recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. That might actually be true, but we also do know that we sure do communicate with them. We sure do cooperate with them. And certainly, we've been sending them money through various channels. And to think that somehow that's not fungible is naive, I think, to be generous with that. Mr. Sopko, I read a little bit about your background. You were a former staffer on the Hill, correct?
Almost 25 years. Almost 25 years.
Well,
I did, yeah.
Former staffers unite, and at some point, sometimes we actually get into some interesting positions. But my point is actually what we're supposed to be doing, right? Which is oversight, which is holding an administration accountable, regardless of who it is. SIGAR was created, if I recall correctly, and signed into law by President Bush. You were appointed by President Obama, correct? You served through the Trump administration and now serving through this administration. And yet, if I recall hearing you earlier, this is probably the least cooperative you have seen the State Department. Is that accurate?
Yes, I would say that.
Okay.
Yes, this is the least cooperative that the State Department's been.
That's troubling, and we've seen it on this committee. In my other committee work, I used to chair the subcommittee that had oversight of the IMF and the World Bank, and it just seems outrageous. And former ambassador, Representative Wagner, was talking about this. It's outrageous that this committee And by extension, you and by extension us are getting stonewalled like that. It's our responsibility to get that information from you and from them. It's your responsibility to get that information, and yet they refuse to do that. So that, I think, is going to be a challenge for us moving forward. I've got very generous of the chair to grant me some additional time and because of this patience. But can I ask one very specific question about the equipment that has been used? Is there any evidence that any of that equipment has made its way into battlefields or into countries in the Middle East or Ukraine? That has been, there's been allegations of that. Are you aware of any evidence of that being the case?
I'm not aware of any evidence of that, and we haven't looked at it either. So we haven't, but we've seen the press reports, but we have no evidence.
Well, I guess that would, I've got a request for you. Please take a look at that, and it'd be helpful if the State Department would cooperate on that. Certainly, I want to touch on the Afghan board, the funds board of trustees. There's 4 members currently, is that correct?
4 or 5? 4. Yes, 4. Yes, 5. I think 5.
5, okay. I saw that there was going to be 2 that were added. Who are these people? What is their background? I mean, we know in the central bank, there's people, there's at least 3 senior Taliban leaders that are currently sanctioned by the UN who sit on their central bank board, including the director and the deputy director.
There are 2 Afghans that were appointed to the board. There's a Treasury Department official and a Swiss official. I
A U.S.
apologize.
Treasury
There's
official.
only 4 individuals.
Okay.
One of the Afghan officials is currently, I'm trying to think his exact title. He's on the Supreme Council of the Afghan Central Bank. So the question we have about that is that a conflict of interest? And is the Supreme Council, which this is the Supreme Council of the current Afghan bank, so that's a Taliban Afghan Central Bank.
Correct. That would seem like a conflict to me, because if I'm reading this correctly, the Afghan fund could be authorized to release these dollars, correct?
That's correct. That's what its purpose was.
And so they're going to go into the DAB, the central bank, which this person sits on, which we know there are Taliban officials on. So isn't it seem a little bit of a stretch that State Department's not aware of this or wouldn't be fighting against that?
Sir, you know, I have a problem with the whole concept, which Mr. West and no one has really explained to us. How in God's name are you going to try to recapitalize the central bank, which is controlled by the Taliban, without helping the Taliban? I mean, maybe I'm just a simple country lawyer from the Midwest. I'm from Ohio, okay?
Well,
but
despite
I
that,
just
I like you.
What's that?
Despite that, I like you, being
okay.
from Michigan.
Yeah, I know. But I used to work for John Dingell. But I just cannot fathom it. And again, maybe I've been doing this job too long. Maybe I've been reading too many audits. But can somebody please explain that to somebody? How the heck are you going to do it? Now, maybe this is, again, a mirage, like I talk about, a facade. We're helping the Afghans, but we're not helping the Afghans. I don't know. That's a policy decision that you all should ask. But I just don't know how to do that.
I agree, but to do that, we need information. You can help us with that, but you need information,
We're giving
correct?
you as much information.
Yeah, no,
and
I'm
this
not-
report should be ready for your perusal in another month, we hope.
Oh, and I appreciate that, and I believe that you are doing everything that you can do, but you have given us chapter and verse about how you have been stymied with your ability to get that information from State Department and others, and I'm glad to hear USAID is cooperating more. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this. I'm gonna leave it with this, because John Dingell actually was very good to me when I came in 2010. And he taught me a couple of things. One of those was he called it the tyranny of the vote, which it doesn't matter who you're with, what you're doing, or how far away you are. They ring the bells, we have to go. The other thing that he taught me was the value and the importance and the constitutional obligation, frankly, we have. And he certainly did that with the famous Dinglegrams. Holding any and all administrations accountable. This, in my opinion, this administration has been some of the least accountable when it comes to this, and I think your testimony has buttressed that. So I, sir, am going to be pledging to work with you to make sure that this administration gets you the information you need to do your job so we can do our job. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, and we're happy to help you and any other member of this committee on that.
With that, the gentleman yields, and with that, I grant myself an unlimited amount of time because this is an interesting topic for me, and I'm actually very pleased that you're here with us today. Thank you. I'm going to revisit what you had said about the weapons, and I know there's no way to track weapons you don't have your hands on. In other words, you don't have serial numbers. We can't track numbers that we don't know. With that said, we've had our weapons, you know, the M4A1 carbine has been seen in the hands of Hamas and Pakistani militants over in Kashmir. I'm sure it's in other places. In your opinion, and this is all theorized, but this is based on an education. You're probably one of the more educated people on this topic. Where else could those weapons come from other than Afghanistan? I mean, we have pretty tight controls on the other weapons that we've disseminated throughout the world. Where else could they be coming from other than the mass weapons storages that we had in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I hate to say that. There is another conflict going on in Ukraine, and
Certainly.
we're shipping weapons like crazy over there. I don't know if those weapons are the same kind. I don't really know. I mean,
So on that topic, I happen to be an expert on that topic.
Oh.
I've been over to Ukraine. I've seen the tracking and the serialization at nausea. With the scanning process, they have an account for every single serialized weapon and munition, for that matter. So I'm pretty sure we have pretty good accountability there. So where else could it come from?
well, just the difference. I know the DODIG has been looking in Ukraine, and there are some questions about how good a job we're doing, but hopefully it's improved. Afghanistan is a likely place. It was a weapons bazaar before, and it's a weapons bazaar probably now. I don't see any change. The only difference is the government isn't cooperating. They at least used to cooperate with us, the prior Ghani regime, but it was a total weapons bazaar. Equipment. Now, you're assuming all the equipment that the Taliban has, they got after they kicked the Ghani government out. The Taliban, I mean, we were getting information that the Taliban basically told their people, don't buy weapons, we're getting it already from the Ghani regime. Yeah. So there was a lot of weapons flowing out before the collapse of the Ghani government.
Excellent point. As a matter of fact, when you mentioned the $7 billion that the Taliban got their hands on, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because most of the weapons actually came from the Afghani government that were basically handed over without a fight.
Sure.
It was turned over. That's part of the botched withdrawal that we did.
Or stolen beforehand. I mean, we did that chapter and verse on audits about how horrible the accounting was, and DOD's accounting of weapons was just horrible in Afghanistan. So I hope it's improved in Ukraine. I haven't looked. It's not my job.
Couldn't agree with you more. As a matter of fact, I was there in 2016, and the interpreters used to talk about this all the time, how there was a severe lack of accountability, not just on weapons, but on vehicle parts, sending the wrong parts, oversight in general, and accountability. Once you point out something with your CIGAR or IG, and I want to point, by the way, for the uneducated public, in an attempt to educate them on the difference between an IG and a CIGAR. And if you could just kind of break this down, in your experience, did your office receive special hiring authorities from Congress, and how that differentiates between the IG and the CIGAR, if you could explain that real briefly.
Oh, yeah. We were given that authority because we're a temporary agency. So we have special authorities for pay and special authorities. And when we go out of existence, we go out of existence. Our employees, they're on a contract, an annual contract, or a little bit, I think 13 months, so they can get health benefits. But that's the benefit of having a special IG. We're temporary. I'm a firm believer in temporary agencies.
And it also has a little more authority, if I understand correctly.
We can look at the whole of government, and that's important. And I've talked about this before in relationship to other places in the world. That's a really helpful situation where you can follow everybody's money. The problem is the DOD IG, let's say, can only look at DOD programs. Aid IG can only look at aid programs. State can only look at state. And it's the same thing with Homeland Security and all of that. You gave us the authority to look at any U.S. dollars spent in Afghanistan on reconstruction, and by any agency. So we looked at the FAA, we looked at the FDIC, we looked at every agency, and there's common themes. You know, if they're stealing from one U.S. government agency, they're stealing from another. And they're also stealing from the money given to the UN. So you allowed us to look at the UN, the World Bank, and all that, which was a fantastic opportunity. I firmly believe in whole of government and whole of governments. And you really need to have somebody able to look at that.
As do I, and that's why I put an IG in the provisions for the Ukraine.
Oh, did you? Oh,
yes,
good.
I did. So I'm
Thank
happy
you.
about that. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank
It's not us, but I think that's a good point to do.
Now, when we look at Afghanistan as it exists now, we could probably agree there's terrorist training bases there, correct?
Yes.
I think around 27 is the last count I heard. I don't know if, you know.
I think so. I think the UN gave 27. I think
That's
was
what
the
I've
number.
heard also. And the fact that we're still giving money to a regime that, as you said, and I quote from an earlier statement, thieves don't advertise what they steal. They probably also don't advertise what they spend their money on. Would you agree on that, too?
Correct.
Okay, so I can safely assume that if you're harboring 27 terrorist bases and you've done things complicit with terrorist activities, that you're probably, some of that money that we're literally sending to the Taliban could, in fact, be used to support these training facilities.
You're absolutely correct, and that's a concern we have.
I want to let that sink into the American public. American taxpayer dollars that we work for and we give to the American government semi-willingly are being used to fund terrorist bases, training people to attack Americans and their interests around the world. I want that to sink in.
Well, sir, we haven't documented that. We've documented
Let's just
everything.
say that it's a clear possibility.
Clear possibility, and that's the distinction between
the fact that we allow that possibility to exist is far beyond egregious. But, well, I'll leave it at that because you and I agree on this.
Yeah. But I could say that's the distinction between the theft and diversion of the prior regime. That usually just went to corrupt officials, and it may have ended up in Northern Virginia or California where they invested their money, or Dubai, but we were pretty certain it wasn't going to terrorist organizations. That's the problem. That's the concern. I said in my statement that this group are a bunch of terrorists, and so very likely it's going to end up the money being diverted to terrorism.
Yeah, so we went from corrupt to evil. Great. As you stated in your this is my last question, but I think it's very germane to what we're trying to cover today. You stated to the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability the Biden administration has not at all been helpful to you in your investigations, and you said in your testimony, and I quote, "Due to the refusal of the state and USAID to fully cooperate with SIGAR, I cannot report to this committee or to the American people on the extent to which our government may be funding the Taliban and other nefarious groups with U.S. taxpayer dollars. We simply do not know, since the Department of State, USAID, the UN, and other agencies are refusing to give us basic information that we or any other oversight body would need to ensure safe stewardship of tax dollars," which supports what we were just talking about. What can Congress do to reverse that trend and bring back accountability for the very dollars that we're responsible for and, indeed, the safety of our country?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned to somebody else who asked the question is, I mean, you know, a formal letter from the committee, a bipartisan, you know, because that sends a bigger message. Bipartisan letter saying, please, you know, or provide the information. I don't know if you can do that. That's helped in the past. I think asking state, as I said, USAID has turned around on, you know, they've been very helpful now. I don't mean to criticize USAID, and that's in part because of letters from committees like this. You just need to break through with state.
So,
I mean,
that's the crazy thing. I've worked with USAID. I've been over to Bangladesh, and I've seen Cox's Bazar, and I've seen the amazing work they've done. They do some amazing things.
They do.
Almost miraculous things.
They do.
What is the deal with the state? Why are they resisting accountability? Why is the Biden administration hiding instead of being transparent what they're trying to do? $1 million question.
You gotta ask them. You know, that's what I can say. I'm a former prosecutor, and I don't know if your background, you were a former prosecutor or defense attorney, whatever. But
I'm just a Marine, simple
Just
Marine.
a Marine. Okay. When somebody, let's go use Shakespeare. He protesteth too much. I always wonder what motivates people. I mean, if that's my personal opinion. This isn't an audit and all of that. My personal opinion is, same with yours. What are they trying to hide? I mean, is it worse than we have already uncovered? I don't know. I remember, I think it was Joe Dunford, another Marine, who I remember telling me, he says, you know, John, every time you come here, you uncover a rock and something ugly comes out. So how do we stop that? And he didn't try to stop me. He said, how do we stop it beforehand? And I created a program to try to do that. These are the type of questions, these are the type of things that we used to deal with the State Department and aid and state, and we used to help them to stop the ugly things from crawling out underneath the rocks. If you don't identify the problem, you're never going to fix it.
Amen.
And that's my concern.
Thank you. With that, I thank the witness for his valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witness, and will ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to the committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.